Välkomna till kvällens seminarium. Jag heter Lennart Kotsalainen och jag representerar Afghanistankommittén här i Stockholm. Och det här seminariet är samma arrangemang med Föreningen för utvecklingsfrågor. Och vi är väldigt glada att det är så många som har kommit hit ikväll. Och vi ska också tacka Folkuniversitetet för att vi får den här fina salen utan kostnad. Det här är ett seminarium som vi kommer att hålla på engelska, så jag går över nu till engelska. So all of you are welcome, and particularly our three speakers tonight. We have a very three eminent, knowledgeable persons who will enlighten us about the results of development assistance in Afghanistan. And the purpose of this evening is really to put the difficult questions on the table. Not to say that how good we are in Sweden or the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan, but just to try to have an honest discussion about the difficulties and the way forward, because there is always a way forward. We have been working in Afghanistan for 35 years. And we know that even in the most difficult circumstances, there is a way forward. But we shouldn't shy away for asking the difficult questions. So we have three speakers, and we have a moderator tonight. And the moderator is Bengt Ekman. He is a member of our central board, and he has previously also been working for SIDA for many years. And I think his last post was to be responsible for SIDA's activities in Afghanistan. So I hand over now to Bengt.
Thank you. I hope you can see and hear me, even if I'm sitting here in my wheelchair. So we are, as Lennart said, we're very happy to have the three distinguished experts on Afghanistan. And I will give a very short introduction to them. We have Adam Payne, who, among other things, is visiting professor of the Swedish University of Agricultural Science, and also fellow, I think you call, of AREU, a think tank on Afghanistan research and evaluation in Kabul, and has worked for many years in Afghanistan. Adam will give his perspective on the totality of aid and development in Afghanistan. Then we will have Karin Crowley, development analyst from SIDA's Afghanistan unit, previously also working on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Karin is also responsible for the Swedish support to the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, which is the major donor mechanism for providing support to Afghanistan's development. And last but not least, we will have Andreas Stefansson, Secretary General of the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan, and formerly working as Country Director for SCA in Kabul for a number of years. And of course, Andreas will focus on SCA and his work in Afghanistan. Since the fall of the Taliban regime in 2001, some 50 to 60 billion US dollars have been provided in aid for reconstruction of the country after more than 20 years of conflict and total collapse of the institutions. Following only a few years of relatively non-conflict, the country has since some 15 years been in accelerating conflict again, and last year some 10,000 civilian casualties were recorded by the UN. And only some 40% of the country is in control, full control by the government. And this time, and with this situation and with this history, there are of course very clear limits of what aid can do. So one has to have a perspective on that as well, certainly. And one can also say that Afghanistan is a very clear case of the fundamental aid dilemma, where aid is needed the most. It is in the worst situation and with the worst prerequisites at hand. The three panelists will, from their respective perspective, give their views and reflect, among other things, on the issues. Is it possible to deliver results when the country is, or parts of the country is at war, in conflict? Is it possible to deliver any effective aid with such a high prevalence of corruption? Afghanistan is ranked 177 out of 180 countries in the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. And how to provide aid that benefits women and girls in a society dominated by patriarchal values. So we will have these three presentations, and following these we will open up for questions after the final presentation. So, Adam.
Is that clearer? Is it on? It is on. Does this better? Yeah. Right, good. I have the advantage of the English language, so I promise not to lapse into high Shakespeare and speak too fast, but stop me if I do run away with myself. I think I've been put here to ask the difficult questions, and that's what I intend to do. I'm going to start with a counterfactual question, deeply uncomfortable, but one that is worth thinking about. Where would we be now if the Taliban was still in power? Think about the conditions under which they arose. The chaos, political chaos, the likes of General Razak, who we have created through military funding in Kandahar. They more or less had a monopoly of violence, which is the first step in state building, which this current government most clearly has not. They were not nice, they were not liberal, but when has state building ever been a nice liberal process? And I think it's worth keeping that in mind when we reflect on what has happened since 2001. And worth remembering that the Taliban have a government in waiting. Most provinces have a shadow state on the Taliban, and it is a reality that we will have to face up to at some stage or other. I also, in addressing the questions, want to reframe them slightly, because I think it raises the issues that I want to address. And those core questions: what can aid do? What can aid do when it parts the country in war or warlike situations? But I think the question needs to be asked: to what extent has aid contributed to instability? To what extent has aid contributed to conflict and war, or funding? And is it possible to deliver efficient and effective aid, which you would all like, when there is high corruption? But then the question can be asked: to what extent has aid actually contributed to widespread corruption, given the context in which Afghanistan is? And then, of course, that knotty question of gender, the rights of women. And the question here is that if you've got a context where people, in a sense, do not have freedom from conflict, fear, insecurity, food insecurity, what possibilities are there to give them freedom to do something. If you lack those very basic freedoms, what is the possibility for individual autonomy and liberty? Which is, in a sense, which is what the gender position is. And I'm not going to give clear answers to those questions, but I think those are fundamental questions we need to think about. So to what extent has aid contributed to instability and conflict? And in making these comments, I think I would like to make clear that I'm talking about the totality of aid. I think in most respects, Sweden is a very good donor. And it stands apart in many ways from the comments that I'm going to make about the totality. It's also a relatively small, a very small player in the scheme of things. And that also needs to be acknowledged. So it doesn't come to the table with the weight of other funders. When I last looked in detail at the figures for the period, I think it was around 2011 and 12, of the total money flow that came into Afghanistan, only just under 10% of it was what we would strictly call aid. The rest was military. And therefore, aid has to be seen in the context of the massive flows of money that came unaccountable for, that had aims in relation to conflict, peace settlement, and used that money instrumentally to buy and establish connections for the purposes of war and peace. The levels of aid actually Afghanistan received in comparison with Iraq and Bosnia are actually relatively low, if you make that comparison. But the significant aspect about the aid landscape in Afghanistan, in comparison with most other countries, is in a sense there was no counterpart to the money flowing in from outside. The tax base for Afghanistan was almost zero. So when they came to the table, to discussion with donors, they had nothing to bargain with. So the power lay entirely with the donors on the other side of the table. And that is a major constraint and a major factor that I think has shaped what has happened since that time. And I'm just going to talk through some of the aspects of aid as it has performed over, I think, the last 10, 15 years. Much of the aid that has been spent has not been spent by government. It's not been spent through government. It's been spent independently by donors. And the US, as one of the major funders, has been one of the worst offenders. So it's been spent entirely off budget, with ministries and government having very little control. That's one factor. The second factor is that after 2001, everyone wanted in. The donor landscape was horrific. Anyone who existed was there. So you found multiple donors inside each ministry, each with their own agenda, each with their own procedures, their own requirements, so that ministries were faced with multiple demands which were almost impossible to meet. And in the key sectors, just for example, of education, health, and agriculture, there were something between 15 and 20 donors in each ministry, with somewhere between 4 to 8 major donors who paid most of the money. That's money, but the problem was that none of the donors were playing to the same tune. And you only have to look at some of the areas in agricultural policy where donors had different agendas and were pursuing them, sometimes overtly, sometimes not so overtly. So in policy making, you might have interests of the ministry, but they were often overridden by other actors. So that's a further dimension. You had this preferential treatment of ministries. I mean, in the period up to 2010, one of the favoured ministries was Ministry of Rural Reconstruction and Development, MRRD. There was also Ministry of Agriculture. MRRD got 4 times the funding of the Ministry of Agriculture. Because they liked the minister, most of the funding was core. A relatively small percentage was off budget. It was entirely the reverse in the Ministry of Agriculture, where there was very little core money and most of it was off budget. So, in a sense, much of this effectively undermined government authority. But it was also an enormous amount of money. There's a second factor that needs to be considered. And it's this, that if you look at where money went at a geographical level, donors had their provinces. So the result was that you had some provinces that were highly funded and some that were not. And the tendency was to fund those provinces that had high conflict, while those that had low conflict got less, much less. And so you had differences. For example, if you compare the aid between Helmand and Sarapul over this period, the aid to Helmand was about $400 per head. Sarapul was $50 per head. So major discrepancies, major unevenness in the distribution of resources across the country. You didn't just get that in total amounts, you got it in the PRTs, in the way in which they were involved in development money, the provincial reconstruction teams. You had it in health funding, so some provinces got much more health funding than others. Not only that, different money, but different program models, different theories of change, different practices. So, major conflicts, in a sense, for a government to have to face with. There was another aspect which I will come back to later about the nature of programming. But that level of funding, that level of divisive behavior, in a sense, encourages rent-seeking behavior. You've created a rentier state, that it's dependent upon external resources, and given the divisiveness between donors and their practices, it encourages all sorts of distributional practices. And that leads into the next question about aid and corruption. Because the argument goes that where there is accountability between the citizen and the state through taxation, rentier practices are less likely. But where, in a sense, you have a state which is entirely dependent on external resources, then that encourages distribution, patron-client relations, and the playing off of one network against another. I mean, being a rentier state is not new to Afghanistan. It's been its history. It was played off between the Russians and the Americans right in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But the level of funding and the distortion of that level of funding really exacerbated that rent-seeking practices and that rent-seeking behavior. And one should remember that it was built on the outcomes of the Bonn Agreement. Now, the Bonn Agreement wasn't a peace settlement. It was a distribution of the spoils between the key political players, an accommodation. So the networks with different interests were in place before the money started flowing in. And the money that has flown in since then has reinforced and consolidated those networks. Now, Karzai was a past master at using money to play off his digital regional networks and keep the peace, as it were. The current president is not so successful. Background as a World Bank technocrat doesn't lend you to the real politics of how one plays with money, buys patronage, which is the nature of what Afghanistan is now. This division of the spoils and the way in which money flowed has reinforced this networked state. It's played to patronage. It has reinforced what we might call corruption, but that is a very sort of culturally specific view. In other ways, you could see it as reinforcing the networks and the distribution of resources between the different groups. Where programs have focused more on some of the, in a sense, the instrumental public goods nature, they have been less susceptible to capture. Roads, schools, you know, the basic public goods. The moment we have strayed into what I would call essentially social engineering, in a sense attempting to build what we see as a democratic state, good governance practice, and all that, we encounter and engage with a different rationale of how things work. And the best example of that is the National Solidarity Programme, which has been one of the big programs for building a so-called relationship between the village and the state, that has attempted to introduce good management, democratic votes, and so forth, and to ensure representativeness, and to build trust between the village and the state. But it has not done that. And it was one of the biggest programs, 3 or 4 billion over its 14, 15-year period. Certainly they had CDCs, certainly they built roads, schools, a level of public provision that had not been seen before, a presence of the state, but the moment the money stopped flowing, back to business as before, where networks of relationships were the key ways in which one gained access to resources. So in many of these there's interventions concerned with bringing about essentially behavioral change, wanting people to behave as good citizens in democratic ways and so forth. There's been an incoherence between what's there and what we've introduced. And we have never resolved that incoherence. And what is there has captured what we have done. That is why, in a sense, the networks, the forms of corruption, money flows, naturally have become deeper and more severe over this period of funding. Would it have been different under the Taliban? Worth thinking about. I mean, at the time of 2001, I remember very well, they were beginning to emerge with their first plans, their first idea of a national plan. They were a rural resistance movement, and you should remember why they arose in the first place, in response to the political violence that we see now. They were not liberal, they were not nice. I suspect we would have funded a lot less. We would have focused on the basic goods. We wouldn't have reinforced the level of corruption, networks that we see now. We probably, the indices in relation to some of the metrics we are concerned with well-being, might not have changed so much. But then you must look at the poverty statistics now and look back to where they're 2001, and they are no better, if not worse. If you actually look at poverty levels, people's opportunities, the nature of the rural economy, things are no better, and I would argue in many senses worse than they were in 2001. I mean, after so much that we have actually put in, and that question needs asking why. The final question and issue I want to come to is that of the question of rights. Now, I think history teaches us that democracy, women's rights, free trade are outcomes of state development. It's not the means by which Sweden or the UK were built. We didn't introduce democracy and then get a British state. It was long fought over. We must remember when women got rights, even in the UK, we're just celebrating now, you know, what happened in the 1920s. Sorry, the 1920s, just about 100 years ago. There are Swiss cantons where women get the vote till the 1960s. We shouldn't forget that. Rights for individuals are an outcome of development processes, not the means by which it happened. And of course, it can be an outcome because those other basic freedoms have been secured. Freedom, food security, health, fear from physical violence. That actually then one can begin to make claims for the individual rights from that. And gender rights, not surprisingly, emerged at a later stage. So there is distinction to be made between freedom from risks, threats, insecurity, violence, and freedom to be able to do things as an individual. And those freedoms from, that essential absence of fear, of course, is not present there in Afghanistan. And how do people handle it? They handle it primarily through the institution of the family and the village. It's why you have these large joint families, patriarchal organizations. But, you know, the saying goes, and I've had it many times, a large family is a secure family. And of course, the security of the family involves compromising the interests of the individual to the good of the family. And it's not just women, it's also sons. I mean, you look at the choices that are available to young men in patriarchal households. They're slightly greater, they're not much that greater, and that women, in relation to marriage, what they can do, what they're able to do without their father's permission, and so forth. And that's carried through into the next generation. So, people achieve security through informal means. And of course, the rights that we expect are because we have states and welfare states that secure our rights as individuals. And those conditions, of course, don't exist in Afghanistan. So the tough question is, to what extent can we promote rights for individuals when the basic preconditions for freedom for individuals are not there? I'm not saying it's impossible, and I think anyone who's worked in Afghanistan will know that actually the rights of women are highly variable, highly variable. I can point to locations where girls were going to school in the 1950s. I can also point to locations where girls still do not get access to school. There are enormous geographical variability. Women are often much more economically active than you would think. I have come across so many women traders in my time in markets, working in hidden, subversive ways, but finding their way. So it's often not as bleak, but there are certainly in many contexts where women have very, very few rights. But the challenge is, to what extent in one's arguments for promoting the rights of women do you actually place them under threat? That if they assert those rights, to what extent is there room for them to challenge some of the greater norms? So those questions remain, I think. But we have had, I would argue in a sense that I think aid, the level of aid, the volume of aid, has undoubtedly contributed to instability. It is part of the problem. And I think the argument has been well made by others where, where more is less, essentially. If we had used much less money, put much less money into the system, we would have not brought about all the effects that we've achieved. I think aid has contributed itself to a significant amount. It's fueled corruption. It's fueled the network state. And it's going to be very difficult to undo that. And I think that our major challenges about delivering rights to individuals in a context where, in a sense, security or freedom from the greater fears are not available. I will stop there.
Thank you. And thank you, Adam. I think you very correctly brought up of issues, and not the least that the military expenditure from the international military forces was some 950 billion US dollars compared to the aid of some $50 billion. And certainly one needs to see those in a totality, what has contributed, and of course, certainly, as you say, corruption, where there is such an amount of money, certainly corruption will come about. So these are very difficult questions, and of course, the thing with Afghanistan many times is that there are no very clear and good answers to things. And I think Karen will also discuss more about the poverty issues that you mentioned, and on what has happened in the lives of the people in Afghanistan.
Thank you. Is it okay like this? No? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Anyhow, thank you for inviting to this extremely interesting seminar. I think the question that I was asked, can development cooperation make a difference in Afghanistan? It's an extremely good question, and a question that we at SIDA ask ourselves also, of course, quite often. And I think coming here after Adam Payne, and it's difficult because, I mean, you've really good speaker, and I sort of knew what you were going to say, and you ask relevant questions, make really good points, but you're a researcher, I'm an aid bureaucrat. I will answer not as reflective. I was thinking, should I sort of rewrite what I was planning to say, but I will not go into, I think you have raised questions for the audience also to reflect upon, and I will give the aid bureaucrats sort of reflection on, can development cooperation make a difference? But just one brief reflection, I think I've thought a lot about the path dependence, how aid was starting in Afghanistan, the way we came in 2002, the division of labor between politicians, military, aid, and as you said, no government counterpart, and how decisions we make today are really shaped by the preconditions that existed early on. And I think, I wouldn't know how, but if we were to take sort of fresh decisions now, probably we would take some other decisions than the ones we are sort of forced of making now since aid started the way it did. Yes, that's a reflection you can make. And so I will talk briefly about what SIDA is working with in Afghanistan and how, and the reason why we ask ourselves that question and a sort of an answer to it, and then also give some personal reflections on which difficulties I see today with working in Afghanistan. Yes. So, briefly, SIDA's work in Afghanistan is governed by a strategy that is decided by the Swedish government. What is quite unique with Afghanistan is that we have a 10-year commitment. We have a strategy which now comes to its end, 2019, and we will prepare a new one for 2020 to 2024. And that's quite unique to have this long-term commitment already from the start. So the government decides the strategy, we implement it, and then we report back to the government on what we have achieved. And if you read the starting sentences there, the purposes of our activities in Afghanistan is to contribute to democratic, peaceful and sustainable development and long-term economic growth that benefits people living in poverty. That was written in a different time. It was written in 2013 probably. Things looked quite different then. One has to remember it, but of course, we can't say that things have progressed in that direction since this was written. We are active in 3 main areas. We work with what is called empowerment, which is democracy, human rights, state building, women's and children's rights, also support to election, support to civil society, strengthening of civil society. We work with education, among others through the Swedish committee, with providing access to and quality of education. And then also with 3 economic sectors, which are sort of employment, enterprise, and economic integration. But that is what Bengt used to work with when he was with our team. It's about building roads, it's about providing access for people to markets, it's agriculture development, and also preconditions for the private sector. And then also humanitarian aid, of course. This year, I think we will have around 1 billion Swedish kronor set aside for Afghanistan, which makes it Sweden's largest development cooperation country. And I think touching a bit on what Adam was talking about, we have writing in our strategy. The Swedish government tells us we should avoid direct cooperation with the state, which leads us into these parallel systems. We work through civil society organizations, through the UN, and a lot through the World Bank, through this huge Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund. But the Swedish government has instructed us not to work directly with the Afghan government. So that's how we do it. Still, we have a commitment to provide 50% of our aid on budget, that is through government systems, and that one we solve through this big World Bank Trust Fund. And the target group, finally, is people living in poverty in rural areas, with a particular focus on women and children. So that is what we do. And then the question, I mean, sometimes we talk about the big and the small elevator, but can development cooperation make a difference in a country at war. And I mean, this comes maybe as a very positive, positive, our partners achieve results in a demanding context. We have seen great results in improving people's access to services, education, health, water. The number of children going to school, it's not sufficient, but it's a lot more than used to be the case. More girls and boys than ever go to schools in Afghanistan today. And I mean, you can find all sorts of indicators, but women's age at first marriage is slowly going up, which shows that how you think about women and girls is probably changing, which is a result in itself. Tax revenue is of course weak, but it's improving, so the capacity to collect taxes is increasing. But then, looking at the bigger picture, when I saw those numbers the first time, poverty used to be 38% in 2011, 2012. Now it's up to 55%. I've never seen such a change. It's quite striking, and that has happened during a period at least when it was economic growth during the first few years. But it's, I mean, that can't be, that is, I mean, extremely bad. And the conflict intensifies and the economic growth can hardly keep up with population growth. So the development progress of Afghanistan is not there. We have programs that deliver, we have partners that deliver, but Afghanistan as such is not doing well. And Afghanistan is Sweden's largest partner country. We are a small player, but we're actually the 5th largest bilateral player in Afghanistan, so we're not that small, as Adam says. But anyhow, I don't know if that's good or bad. But anyhow, I mean, so shouldn't we want to see also some impact at the larger level? And then I think sometimes when you look at facts from Afghanistan, you feel a bit like Alice in Wonderland. Things are just not adding up. I mean, these are not always comparable numbers, but here you have the US annual military expenditure up to 2014, $40 billion US. Then you have Afghanistan's GDP, 20 billion. So actually, I mean, the US has put more than double of Afghanistan's GDP into the military effort. And then you look at the small numbers there. The Afghanistan's national budget, $6.5 billion approximately. That is the budget of the city of Stockholm and Uppsala combined. They are 35-40 million people. That budget should cater for a domestic war, for building schools, for building health centers. And then you have the total aid, and then you have Sweden's aid. So I mean, I think it tells something. It tells that things don't really add up, I think. It's and then I think if we ask the question, can aid bring development? I think one could also wonder, those 40 billion, they did not bring peace. And the small amounts put on development don't bring development. But I think development cooperation makes a difference. It creates preconditions for better living conditions for people living in poverty. A generation of girls and boys have received education, midwives have been trained, democratic structures in villages all across Afghanistan have been initiated. But, I mean, two things are missing for this to be sustainable. I mean, the peace is missing. Without peace, there cannot be sustainable development. And also, the growing poverty numbers. People don't have ways of making their livelihoods. There are no jobs. There are no investments in Afghanistan. There are no jobs there. And that is not something that aid can create. We can help building preconditions, but we cannot build jobs. We cannot build peace. So, yeah. This picture was taken by Enayat Adel, who is now with the Swedish committee. He was a colleague of ours. It's Jalalabad, I think. So how many minutes do we have left now to problematize? A few minutes. Yeah. As I said, I will give some personal reflections about what is difficult with working in Afghanistan. And one can be a bit, one can say that yes, there is corruption and there is conflict and there is weak capacity, and those can be seen as problems, but that is also the reason why we are there. Those are the reasons why the Swedish government has tasked SIDA to be in Afghanistan. So that is something we have to work with and around and struggle with. But one thing, I mean, we always talk about security, and security constrains us in several ways. It makes it difficult for us to go out in the field. I visited Afghanistan several times, but as an employee here in Stockholm, I go to Kabul and then I go back home. Our colleagues in the embassy, they travel. They are able to go out, but they go out to very predetermined places. It's not that they say that, I want to go here, let's make it. You look at a map and see what is possible, and then you visit what's there. So it's difficult to be strategic in your field visit. But it also, I think, limits our contact with the people we are there for. We can call them target group or beneficiaries or whatever. It's people living in poverty in Afghanistan, women, men, boys and girls. We don't meet with them. Not those who are based in Kabul, they meet them sometimes, but I haven't met. And I think that limits our understanding of poverty. What does poverty look like for a person living in it? What does poor people think about their lives, hopes, futures? What decisions do they take in a situation like the one they live in? We also have a problem with continuity, big staff turnover. People stay 1.5 years in Kabul. You're in and out, in and out. What does that give? I mean, development cooperation is money, but it's also relations. It's trustful relations between us and the ones we work with. And we don't have that time to build those relations. And sometimes I pity the people in the ministries. They meet me once, and then they meet someone else, and hopefully we say similar things, but it's not really certain. People come with different agendas and views, and you can't build up relations with the ones who really control the funds you need for your development. So I think that is a problem. And it's good that we have partners like the Swedish Committee, who has more permanence and long-term presence, and also the World Bank, which is a big partner, have a different way of ensuring continuity. But I think this means something for the trust between us and the Afghan government, and also about our understanding of how they reason, how they think, why they take certain decisions. One more? One more? I also think it's given that we are very dependent on our partners in order to get information, things we could get first-hand information in places I worked in before, we can't here because we are quite limited in how we can travel. What does it mean that an area is Taliban-controlled? I think it can mean a lot of things. It can mean that education and health services are being delivered that we, through the World Bank, pay for. In a lot of contexts, I think it's like that, but not in all, probably. And not being able to really understand the full picture makes it also difficult for us to take certain decisions. If we could say, this is what it looks like now, then you have sort of a basis to take decisions in a more informed way. I think as it is now, we go along. Yeah. And then finally, I looked at the population pyramid of Afghanistan once, and I realized that I think only 15% of those alive now have meaningful memories of a time when Afghanistan was not at war. And we are still obsessed with the Second World War here that we weren't even involved in. We talk about why were we involved or were we not, did we do the right things? But to understand what that means for a population, for people, what decisions they take, how they see upon their life. I mean, what you talked about, Adam, the role of the state versus the role of your networks, your family. I think to understand that, imagine 15% probably has meaningful memory. Of course, it's not war everywhere, but I mean, it affects the country as such, as a whole. And to me, that is that is really a big question where I think a different or a better understanding from our side could change development cooperation somewhat. And then my head of unit sent some words with me. She said, if our Afghan colleagues, they risk their lives daily, and our partners, to do development cooperation because they believe in developing Afghanistan, then we must support them. So I'll end there. Yes.
Thanks a lot, Karin, for giving your views and the presentation of the Swedish aid, with its achievements, but also a lot on the challenges. And certainly, and I think this issue about the poverty. And we can also see here, in Sweden, some of the results of the increasing poverty with the numbers who have come to seek a better future in Sweden and in Europe. I mean, these are things that are, of course, very much connected, that people try to, and one should also remember that some 80% still live in rural areas in Afghanistan, and many have not been reached at all by this development cooperation. They live in roadless land and way beyond, and have no access to schools and clinics. I mean, we have not been able to reach all over Afghanistan with the development cooperation. Yes, a certain part. So, Andreas, over to you, and to present Swedish committee, what they are doing and what you see as challenges.
Can you hear me now? Should it be like that? Do I look really weird? I'm not sure it should be like this, but yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm glad to see that so many defied the rain and the autumn weather and came out here. Really fascinating to listen to both of you. I was perhaps not prepared for so much of a critical analysis as a starting point, but I also very much appreciate the perspectives you shared, Adam, which I think are very important to keep in mind. And I think it was important and interesting, Karin, to hear your reflections when you summarized towards the end, because I think we need to look at both the, so to speak, achievements and what they actually mean for ordinary Afghans, but of course keeping in mind the challenges that we have with the transition that the country is going through, you could say, in a way from well, towards a new social contract, perhaps, which we can ask questions about. Talking about questions, we will get back to sessions later on, so I will not right now actually engage too much in so to say, problematizing the three questions. I'd rather, as I was asked to do, describe a bit of what SE does and what we mean that we actually are achieving, and putting that in the light of challenges. I might repeat some of the challenges that actually have been mentioned so far, and if I do so, I'll try to just swift through them quickly. And I'll also try to summarize some of the success factors that we feel that we can draw some lessons learned from the results that nevertheless are being achieved in Afghanistan. Well, who we are. Yeah, these are the three points that I'll be going through. To start with, who we are. I sometimes use this picture, and I don't know if anybody is around here who actually is in the picture or who was around at the time. Some known faces here might have been there in those early days. This is how the Swedish committee started once upon a time, as a campaign against the Soviet invasion. And it quite quickly also developed into development aid in Afghanistan. But the campaign was about Afghanistan's right to self-determination. And that kind of still is the soul of the Swedish committee. We focus very much on self-determination and empowerment of our target groups today through our development interventions. Of girls, women, well, girls and boys, of course, rural communities, the most poor, people with disabilities, marginalized groups that need to be strengthened in order to be part of developing society and building their own future. The dream that motivates us and that we aim for is to see an Afghanistan at the end of the day. It'll certainly take a long time, but an Afghanistan free from poverty, violence, and discrimination. The approaches that we apply are what we sometimes call the rights-based approach, which means that we believe that the Afghan people have certain fundamental rights, and we work with interventions within, I think there are some pictures here, within health, education, community-driven development, and what we call political and public commitment. We work with interventions here to strengthen people's access to rights, access to health rights, education, access to being part of decision-making processes in society. And we also work with commitment, both within Afghanistan, but of course internationally, and then here in Sweden, for the cause of development in Afghanistan. The rights-based approach also means that we work very much with local ownership, which is a key approach of the Swedish committee. Development is not something we can enforce or push through. Development is something that Afghans themselves must be part of formulating and owning. So we sometimes talk about putting our target groups in the driving seat of their development. We have some 13,000 totally members and active contributors, individual contributors. And I think quite many here are actually members of the Stockholm local chapter. We are one of the biggest employees in Afghanistan. We have about employers. We have about 6,000 staff working with us in our different interventions, of which more than 99% are Afghans. Once again, even that local ownership permits our organization as such in terms of who actually works in the organization and manages our interventions. I've briefly mentioned which groups, the more vulnerable and marginalized groups that we work with for. Context and challenges. We have heard quite good description so far of context and challenges. I will still just touch on a few and will try to avoid too much repetition. And by the way, since we started off with quite a good critical analysis, I will perhaps put more emphasis throughout this presentation on actually showing that some results still are being achieved. I hope I will not be accused of painting a too rosy picture, but we'll come to that perhaps later in the discussions. Of course, what normally comes to mind with Afghanistan in many people's minds is the widespread insecurity and fragility of the country. And this picture, this is a snapshot, you could say, of a situation. It's of course it fluctuates a lot, but this is a picture of what the country looked like in terms of control and disputed areas about a year ago. And I think, as you already mentioned, we have a situation where the state is considered now to perhaps control just about a third of the country, and that's mainly the cities. While you have a lot of Afghanistan, perhaps more than half, 2/3, that are actually actively disputed. So here you have what is in green is total or predominant Taliban control, and then you have a lot of static or active disputed control. Total green is government. Sorry. It's a bit small text, but anyway. And of course, this translates in reality into a situation where people live under some kind of, at least in most of rural areas, in some kind of hybrid governance, where not only the state is present, but also Taliban has varying degrees of presence and control. Sometimes they are called the shadow government because they do actually have established in all provinces shadow representatives, not necessarily administrative officers and so on, but shadow representatives on governor's level, meeting up with the state's representatives on all levels actually, education representative, health representative and so far. It becomes a very intricate context for both us to work in and for local communities to live in, where constant negotiation goes on between the different governments, so to speak. This widespread insecurity is of course has a terrible impact on civilians. Annually, about some 12,000 people suffer, either get injured or die. I think I will try to skip a few things since we've already had some of those things mentioned earlier. Fragility, we have talked about Afghan state being one of the most fragile states. We have a situation with very weak institutional capacity. And that, of course, also then relates to what we have talked about in terms of ability to absorb support and development aid. Rule of law is very weak, very low trust in police, who often also are very corrupt. Low trust in police and courts, which then in turn, of course, means that people often rely on the so to speak, organic or traditional structures that you talked about, Adam. What also further complicates the situation right now is the presence of IS. To some extent, the presence of Taliban does not necessarily mean that actors as us face challenges in the sense that we actually have to close. The Taliban do seek some kind of legitimacy from the local population. And when we work with acceptance for who we are and what we're doing, we can often also gain acceptance from the Taliban, since they are interested in listening to the local population. So while the Taliban are seeking some kind of legitimacy and listening to the local population, IS certainly do not portray any such interests. I would assume their main interests are serving their supporters behind laptops via social media, so to speak. That means that actors like us become soft targets, unfortunately. The second picture there is our office in Jalalabad in end of January. That wasn't directly targeted itself. It was very unfortunately for Save the Children, their office, which was next door, got targeted, and they even lost a few staff members, unfortunately. Our office got dragged into the conflict when they tried to get the IS combatants out of the area. But this is a situation that many Afghans are concerned about, of course, in addition to the wars that have prevailed for so long. This IS presence also, of course, brings in a certain sectarian dimension, since they tend to target the Shia minority, Hazaras. They do not have any real territorial control, but engage in asymmetrical warfare. Well, to look further at some of the challenges, of course, we've already talked about the feeble economy, the lack of growth. There has been a quite substantial growth the last 10-15 years, but it's very much an artificially induced growth, particularly through military spending. And now we see a slowdown that takes place at the same time as you've had quite big flows of returnees, particularly from the neighboring countries. That, of course, makes these challenges that we've been talking about even more exacerbated with poverty and so on. Corruption has been touched upon, and I would, we'll probably get back to that later, but I would like to of course, highlight once again the kind of paradox of large investments, to some extent at least, being needed, investments, long-term investments definitely being needed, at the same time as you have weak institutions that can't really take care of the investments. And that's, I think, what you were talking about before as a paradox in aid. Some reforms, though, with regards to corruption. Ashraf Ghani, the president, does have at least in writing a commitment towards reforms on anti-corruption. And there are some signs, also not only in writing but in practice, that this is taking place. There are even people far up in the ministries, on deputy minister level and so on, that have been sentenced and imprisoned, and of course, still, it's just a bit of addressing on the surface, while the big chunk of corruption still prevails, unfortunately. Education. I would like to now touch on some areas where we, although having all these challenges in mind, still see positive and substantial developments. And education, I think, is worth highlighting as one of the big successes in Afghanistan, where you, say, 20 years ago had perhaps only a few thousand kids that accessed education. And today you would have somewhere around, even though statistics have to be taken with quite a lot of pinches of salt, but today you have somewhere around 7 million kids that access education, 40% of which are girls. Our role in this, we work with strengthening access beyond government schools, so even further out into rural areas, very much through community-based education, small village schools that the communities run themselves and we support. We reach out today to about 80,000 children. Community-based education is a concept that a lot of NGOs work with. And we're one of the biggest ones contributing to access in rural areas. We also build capacity of teachers through teachers training and of local education authorities. I would say that one of the big developments and achievements within education is actually attitude towards education and demand to education. I wasn't around in the 80s and 90s when SA ran its activities, but some of the old hands have described, and our Afghan colleagues, the senior ones, would describe, how in certain areas, in the more conservative areas, education was frowned upon, especially, of course, when it comes to girls' education. Today, even in the most remote areas, education quite often peaks as the highest priority that local communities have. And Adam, you pointed out what would have happened if Taliban stayed on, which is an interesting discussion, of course. We know that they have upgraded themselves, so to speak, to a version 2.0 in terms of attitude towards education, while they were generally very reluctant and opposed to at least see girls progressing beyond class 3, sometimes class 6. But today actually even promote the right to girls' education. Still, of course, within very strict parameters of how education then takes place. They also have concerns about curriculum, of having more religious subjects and so on. But I think the changes that you see with education actually, to some extent, are revolutionary, because in some rural areas, it's actually the first generation ever that now is growing up and being able to read and write. And that does make a difference in terms of how you actually can link up to a wider economy, how you can participate in local decision making, the role that women can have of taking jobs and so on. I think it lays foundations, structures, that eventually will carry both development and sustainable peace. And we're talking far into the future, of course. Let's see here now what's happening. Yeah, health. Would need to put my mobile here as well to keep a track of time. In health, likewise, the results are, if you take a two-decade perspective, results are encouraging, although, of course, a lot remains to be done. 20 years ago, perhaps only a few percent of the population could access basic health services. And today, the right to health is ensured to Figures, again, very difficult to say, to be precise about, but perhaps 2/3 of the population can, through walking distance, reach health services. And even though the figures are being debated on how much maternal mortality and child mortality actually is decreasing, the trend is certainly there, that it is decreasing. From a very, very high level, of course. Likewise, access to clean water is being broadened, which also, of course, improves health outcomes. And one of the modalities that have been used to achieve this, which SA is part of, is public NGO partnership. Through ARTF funding that you mentioned, where the Ministry of Public Health contracts to NGOs like us to deliver services. And while that in itself contains a whole bag of questions and critical examination, nevertheless it has, I think, and I would argue, contributed to rolling out services in a much more efficient way than if the state had tried to set it all up by itself. So SA has taken on 2 provinces. So what happens is you're contracted to be responsible for a whole province. We have taken on healthcare in Lagman and Wardak, which serves about 2.5 million patients annually with everything from healthcare, health post, to clinics, to provincial hospital, and includes vaccination, training of midwives and nurses. Finally, an area which also shows some interesting developments, and that's participation in development processes, whether in village level or in national politics. Adam, you mentioned the Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Reconstruction flagship, the NSP, National Solidarity Program, which has meant that most, if not all, villages in Afghanistan have development councils that are elected and that are empowered to handle sums that are channeled from the state for development. And these services, I would argue, actually are becoming increasingly popular in the local communities. We know that the development councils as such sometimes close shop and dry up, so to speak, when the funding dries. But the services as such are becoming increasingly popular, and we see that in areas where the Taliban have quite substantial control, they also are becoming more and more careful about denying people access to what is channeled through CDCs. But of course, there are a lot of signs that the whole concept might not be fully effective, especially when it comes to the ambition to have women's participation in these community development councils, where in some situations the option is then to create, at least in the more conservative areas, options to create parallel CDCs. In terms of participation, I think one should also mention politics, of course. In Afghanistan, you today have a parliament with, what is it, some 25% female representation, which is even higher than what you have in the American Congress. Likewise, on provincial level, you do see women engaging in politics and being part of development councils and so forth. Participation and inclusion of marginalized groups has also changed quite a lot over the last decades. People with disabilities today have a quite different level of access to society, participate in the economy, and in decision making. I think in terms of women's participation in the economy, even sectoral interventions as ours, where we work with healthcare and education, are very crucial, where you actually have women stepping in and becoming midwives, becoming nurses, becoming teachers, and becoming role models in their local communities, in rural areas, as perhaps the first generation of women who have paid jobs and who start to take part of decision making in the local community. Whoa, I don't know if you can read that, quite small text. Some of the success factors I would want to point at in terms of our experiences of how we, although we have all the challenges of corruption, weak institutions, fragility, we still do achieve some important developments. Now, local ownership, which I mentioned in the beginning, I think that's extremely important, well, in all development interventions, but I think particularly when you have a situation where the country is in conflict and you have quite little of institutional capacity. I think local ownership, working on community level and gaining trust and acceptance for what you do and what the ambitions of the interventions are. Another success factor is the partnership that you can see, then, which I mentioned, for instance, in health sector and in the rural development sector, between authorities and NGOs, and that goes in terms of rolling out services and reaching target groups. Empowerment, and I would particularly want to point at empowerment of women here. Now, through the education sector development that you see and access to education, of course what is happening is that structures are being affected, societal structures where women are starting to be empowered to take a role in society. When we work with such structural developments, we also look into the sets of values, and those of course are more delicate to work with, but with the strong ownership of local communities in the actual development interventions, what often comes up is that they themselves put forward progressive concepts within their own culture and own religion. Notions that women do have rights, there is right to education within Islam and so forth. Working with local community leaders, with religious leaders and so on building on progressive concepts that can be found locally is one of the kind of approaches we use, and which is a success factor. I've talked about women becoming role models, and of course, not the least, to also engage men in the process. We have work internally in the organization where we try to work more strongly with engaging men in development, but of course also in the communities. Finally, just briefly, with regards to insecurity, of course, a success factor in actually managing to achieve results is to work with innovative approaches, and with that I mean, for instance, in difficulties in monitoring, we strengthen communities' own participatory monitoring, which is quite effective in the sense that they actually want to see the services being delivered and will inform if they actually are not in place. But of course, there are also different methods that development actors as us use in terms of what we call third-party monitoring, where you contract companies or organizations that have access in certain areas to report back on whether the interventions are happening or not. And finally, I think, well, a factor that is very essential for success and has been a success factor for SCA is the long-term perspective. And I would agree with what has been said before, that it is not necessarily massive funding that Afghanistan has been needing the last 10, 15, 20 years. Perhaps they have actually had too much. As you say, what was the expression? Less is more is less. I think that what, in contrast, is important in Afghanistan is the long-term perspective, that no quick fixes can be achieved. But what Afghanistan needs is to go through these troubled times, build institutions that can become stronger in addressing the challenges, and that requires a long-term perspective. And in that sense, Sweden is of course, a very good example, where it takes on this 10-year perspective. And perhaps funding volume should not always be what we focus on primarily. I'll leave it there and we come to the questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Andreas. I think it was interesting to listen to first Adam's reflections on when the donor funding started some 50 years ago, that there was no one at the other part of the table, and the donors managed everything. And secondly, to listen to Andreas, that the success factor for the Swedish committee has been to build from a partnership at the local level and to build the ownership and support the ownership and start from that, which is two totally different kind of approaches. And one can clearly see that some of the failures that especially Adam but also Karin highlighted was due to some of the bigger donors' notion of quick fixes and not having any long-term perspectives at all. So, I mean, of course, we can now see what has been done, all the failures. The question is, what should we do to do things better ahead? What can be done? What should we do now? Should we change the way of partnership? Should we work directly with the state? Should we provide less funding, as Andreas was wondering about? Or what should we do differently? So that is one question. Another question, before I let the audience in, is if there, and that is a big if, of course, there would be some sort of peace accord between the government and the Taliban. How donors then relate to this new development? Should we do things differently then? Or how is there a risk that all the donors then just withdraw from Afghanistan because they are afraid of dealing with the Taliban? Or what is your thinking about those issues? So I let any one of you start, and then others may join.
Yes. What to do differently? Just a brief comment. I mean, I was talking, in a sense, the macro picture. Yes, I understand. I was talking very much about the macro picture and putting things in context over a long period of time. I mean, I think one of the interesting things and what one learns from Afghanistan is about variability. And it's quite easy to identify a context in which actually there has been long-term education. Girls have been going to school for a long time. I mean, this path-dependent process, where there have been significant gains in particular locations. And I think the support long-term for the basic public goods with a very long-term vision is, of course, the path to actually follow. And I think one that should be supported, basic public goods of education and health. That ensures and builds for a future, where I think we have much less traction, much less possibility, is our attempts at social engineering, to put it bluntly, about introducing democratic structures, good governance at a state level. The conditions now are so hostile to that, and we've created such a mess, make it such a mess of what we've done that it's actually very difficult to unpick that. So my money is on modesty of ambition, long-term vision, and focus on the public goods.
I think this question about too much utility money is quite tricky. I mean, the easy answer is, of course, you should do the right thing with the money you have, but what is then the wrong thing? And I mean, given how Afghanistan's population is, how the population structure looks like, just to keep the same level of access to education, I don't know, can we say 75% of the children go to school, just to keep that, not to increase? You need to spend maybe 20% more funds every year in order to build schools to meet the needs of all those children. So even without improving access, you would need to spend a lot more in teacher training, building schools, and so on. Yes. What to do differently? I think reflecting a bit on what was touched upon initially, that did you just say that bilaterally, or did you say, I can't remember if you said it, that I mean donors were carving up the, yeah, you said it publicly, that donors were carving up ministries among themselves, and I think, do I need to hold it more closely? Yes. Okay. Better if you try to think. Yeah, I can hold it, okay. Yes. We have been touching about on the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, this huge World Bank Trust Fund that we contribute to. It's about $800 million every year they invest in Afghanistan from 16 donors, and I think in a way they are an extreme blessing for the Afghan government. Instead of having to deal with 12, 15 different donors, they have one partner that has dialogue with them. So I think that is, should we be able to work directly with the state or not? I think that we should be happy that we have an interface. So the Afghan government could be happy that they have an interface between 15, 16 donors and the money. And I think that's something that we should continue with. Maybe we need to engage more closely with the World Bank on how the programs are being developed and implemented. But having us and everyone else having dialogue with the ministers, I think we should not go that way. Yeah.
Would you like to add on, Andreas? Or?
Can I take this? Well, there was a final question as well on if there is a peace agreement.
Yes.
But I was thinking in terms of what we should be doing differently, or perhaps more of and less of. I'm thinking that the experience of these kind of massive quick fix approaches is of course very detrimental, I think, to develop in Afghanistan. And we've seen the kind of artificial growth that came with the massive military spending that hasn't then been sustained. So that's at least lessons learned. So I do promote what I also concluded with, the very long-term approach. And I think what can be put more focus on is building capacity locally, because what has happened in the institution building is very much looking into getting ministries and government up and running. But once you get down on the local level, very little capacity is actually there, which in turn, of course, then contributes to inefficiencies and corruption. So I think more focus on capacity development locally.
Right. Thank you so much. Now you have all been listening for a long while, and now it is your chance to put questions to the panelists, raise issues, maybe come with another perspective or so. So please.
Should we put our chairs here?
Yes, please. And please speak loud and clear so that we all can hear you. Here. And you have a microphone coming here, maybe?
Yes. We have limited time, and I think we can all subscribe to healthcare and education, but somehow we are then talking about permanent dependency on aid. I would like to hear you develop a little bit how you think the economy of Afghanistan could develop. You also mentioned the poverty figures, which is probably a root cause of some of the conflicts if inequalities are increasing. So could you please say something how you think they should have their own money both on individual but also on state or provincial level?
The one point that I actually missed and which I would have added is the question of employment and jobs, because actually that to me is as significant as almost everything else, because with a risingly educated youth, you are actually storing up issues for the future. Jobs and employment is the major issue. And actually, a little reflection back to what happened in Sweden in the late 1880s and 1890s, about what happened when the rural economy failed in Sweden, and the large-scale migration that went to the States, 60 or 70 million, I think, from Europe elsewhere that migrated to the States at that time. Afghanistan is in a similar position, that you've actually got a very large rural surplus population with actually very little work, very little possibilities in agriculture. And you've got an urban economy that hasn't grown, that is not generating employment, which is why you're getting so much migration out. I would say employment and generating employment is very high on the agenda. I am skeptical to the extent to which employment can be generated within agriculture, very skeptical. I see little possibilities within the urban economy, given Afghanistan's position in the regional economy. It's got some very competitive neighbors, Pakistan and elsewhere, who are not going to encourage Afghanistan's own economic development. We have denied Afghanistan many of the trade barriers that we used to develop our own economies, because they have now, in a so-called free trade model, very few tariff barriers are allowed. I think we have got to do something much more systematic and structural to support the development of Afghanistan's economy. And in the short term, focus much more on employment and the generation of employment to be able to support things for the future. But there is no easy answer to that either.
I think one aspect that could be added there is in the example you took of what happened in Sweden. I mean, what you have in Afghanistan is a similar situation, but what you actually have is a massive influx of returnees. I think in 2016 we had some 600,000 people that returned from Pakistan. And prior to that, you've of course over the years had millions. And while that is of course something that Afghans celebrate in a sense, it also puts of course very much strain on a very fragile situation already. And I think that's also something the world community needs to consider in terms of migration policies. What does it do to a country that's already going through a lot of hardship? And then I agree that employment, of course, and there is, I mean, you do see a diversification of resources in the rural areas today, of income resources and different sectors of jobs. But of course, what the government is hoping for is to get through these big mining projects and the gas transit projects of gas from Turkmenistan and so on. But many of those hopes have not been able to be realized. And that's partly, of course, because of insecurity, but also extremely lengthy negotiation processes and so on. But I mean, some put hope in that as both generating a lot of revenue and providing jobs.
One just further comment. I mean, I work across different layers, and it's been very interesting to see. I mean, Nepal is a comparable country. We've had a lot of migration. And, yes, Nepal has had a lot of out-migration, people going to work in the Middle East and so forth. And the remittances that come back have probably done more to support the rural and urban economy than anything else. And there is comparative data, I know, actually World Bank has done some very interesting studies on actually allowing migration and the value of remittances over and above anything else to help support local economic development. Now, of course, politically, encourage migration so that you can generate remittances is a challenge. Migrants are not exactly flavour of the month. But it is a route that may offer possibilities if we think about it more seriously.
Yeah, I mean, linking employment and poverty. I think a really tragic tragic fact in the most recent living conditions survey is that, yes, poverty is higher if you don't have a job, if you are a day laborer, if you have casual employment. But the number of working poor is also increasing. To have a job is not a security against poverty, and that is changing and worsening if you compare over time. So, I mean, having jobs, employment is crucial, but today that is not enough to stay out of poverty in Afghanistan. And that is a really, tricky situation, I would say, making it worse.
Please, coming. Please.
Thank you so much. Actually, I worked in MRRD, very closely worked with ARTF and Iraq. My question is, when the policy is prepared, as you said, like, whenever there is funding in Afghanistan, it is being shared or it is policy. The government of Sweden, they prepare the policy. And according to the policy, the fund is being channeled in Afghanistan. Do you think that policy is shared with the government of Afghanistan? Because, I mean, that policy could be against the national interest of Afghanistan, or that could be against, I would say, against the people of Afghanistan. One question that is from you. The other question I'll ask from the Adam, you might have went through the ANDS, Afghanistan National Development Strategy. And when these strategies are being prepared, don't you think they're given to the situation of Afghanistan, the feasibility is very less to implement all these strategies? Because when you look at the ANDS, they would say after 3-4 years, the people will have access to education, or 90% will have access to, I would say, pure water. But I would say after 5 years or after 6 years, the situation remains the same. So at the fundamental levels, I mean, policy making, I would say, is a big issue. So can you please explain?
So I should maybe start with the question on the Swedish strategy for Afghanistan that the government decides on. And I think I made maybe a bit of a too large point of that single sentence in the strategy that says that we should not have direct cooperation with the Afghan state. That is the reality of most donors. They haven't, it's not written that clearly, but very few donors have large programs channeled directly to Afghan ministries. Most donors work through other organizations, but with support to Afghan priorities, of course. What we do in Afghanistan and support is part of what Afghan government prioritizes for its development needs. I should have made that very clear from the beginning. And of course, we have consultations with the Afghan government when the strategy is being prepared. This is how Sweden responds to the needs as expressed by the Afghan government. And I should have made that more clear from the beginning. And yeah.
The list of policy corpses litter Afghanistan of the last 15 or 16 years, and ANDS was just another one of them. I mean, you can trace all these major policy statements in which great efforts have been put into what should be done. And then they are rewritten again 4 or 5 years later, saying exactly the same thing with very little reflection of actually why it wasn't done. And I remember the ANDS very well. I mean, it was written specifically for Afghanistan to get debt relief. It was in that HIPIC sort of World Bank, IMF model. And the first version was rejected by the IMF. And USAID parachuted in a team to rewrite it to make it acceptable for the IMF. That's what happened. You have your answer.
Could I just add that, I mean, these national development strategies, they nevertheless form the basis for all the donor commitments. So when they met in Brussels in 2016, meeting in Geneva now later this year, of course, they still look back upon those policies and the national priority programs of them, and then hold the government to account on or mutual commitments actually, of funding of one way and certain reforms of the other way. So I think that, of course, they are quite often pushed through by the big players, but I think that they don't only end up being documents, so to speak. They are actually the frameworks that we use when we follow up on commitments, mutual commitments, whether they're flawed or not.
My name is Kavi. I'm actually working with SIDA. I mean, listening to President Adams and the perspective you are having here, tend to suggest the way SIDA is intervening through
Can you take the mic closer?
is intervening through the ARTF, tend to suggest there are some conflicting perspectives here. On the one hand, my understanding is intervening through the ARTF would be a way of harmonizing the donors' approach to kind of pool funding, which will be based on a common understanding of the program and so on. But at the same time, on the other hand, from what you are saying, seem to suggest that there are different donors' agenda, driving their own agenda, and working in parallel to government systems. So my simple question is, following discussion and discourse on the aid effectiveness agenda from 2000 and onwards, would you then suggest that this aid effectiveness agenda, the Paris Declaration, or the Rome agenda, the Ghana Declaration, are not relevant for Afghanistan given the context and the situation of permanent instability and
Straight answers. I think it's highly relevant. The issue is it's not been followed. But donors with their interests, in a sense, have not responded to the aid effectiveness agenda. I mean, if there had been much more coherence from the beginning, much more agreement about how things should happen, much more support from government, I think you might have seen somewhat different outcomes.
I think you see some remarkable successes when it comes to aid coordination in Afghanistan, and you also see some failures. And I would say the way we work through the ARTF is a remarkable success. It has its flaws, but it is a success. To have $800 million with one counterpart to the government, I think that is, you don't see that in another country. So especially given the weak capacity of the Afghan state, I think that's a remarkable success, with its own difficulties. But then you have the off-budget funds. And I wish I could quote statistics, but I think off-budget funds to Afghanistan is not unusually high compared to how we work in many other countries. We work through civil society, we support UN funds in many other countries as well. So I don't say it's not a problem, but I wouldn't say that Afghanistan deviates extremely much from what is normally done. The difference is that Afghanistan's budget consists of aid money. In other countries, you have tax money going into it. In Afghanistan, I think it's about 60–70% of the state budget, which is aid. And that makes a difference.
Operational budget is now up to 50% funded by own revenue.
Yes.
Which is quite interesting.
Yes.
There are some developments even there.
Yes. It's the development budget, which is, I think, 80% of the funds, so yes. But I think that makes the difference, that Afghanistan has very little own resources that it controls.
And of course, the military budget is still funded 100% of the US and some others. So, please.
Hi, my name is Mohammad Reza. I'm working at SIDA in the training program. I have a question from Adam. How can we fight against this extreme high corruption? For 2 days ago, I just read a news that officials just buy aid money apartment in Dubai or that First Lady was involved in a big corruption about the Promet project. And you had the example of Karzai or the Ministry of Education who built hundreds of engineering schools. And I have another question that is about the distribution of it in province level or in geographical level. According to that map, some provinces like Bamiyan, Daikundi, Pur, there are lots of very, very poor people, and they are in a green area according to that map, but there's not so much contribution there, or the volume is not so much.
I have no, I mean, there is no simple answer to curbing corruption. The problem is, in a sense, the systems that have been created and the levels of funding that still continue to fuel it. That's a long-term solution, and you have no state that's in a position to actually really enforce it. I mean, many of the big governors still, have their own revenues that they keep from cross-border trade and so forth. The level of remittance of tax revenues from the key provinces to the central state is still very low. So as long as these key big political players have independent revenue sources, the chances of things changing are probably quite small. On the issue of funding to provinces, the ministries unfortunately have never been in a position to ensure balanced funding according to need and according to population. That has never happened. And so you do indeed get, and particularly the poverty levels, the higher you go, the greater the poverty levels. So the higher altitude provinces, Bamiyan, Gore, Badakhshan, that's where you get the really, and Sarapur, really high poverty levels. But these have often not been the provinces that have been of interest to donors.
I think one big challenge that we had, at least up until recently, is that a lot of money went in through the military apparatus for stabilization purposes. And that meant that actually the more insecure provinces actually saw more resources being funneled, as you also mentioned before, I think, Adam. And I think that's partly what you were indicating when you said certain parts in central Afghanistan seem to be rather stable, rather secure. Why isn't there more funding going there? At the same time, I would also like to challenge the notion that certain areas are more or less void of development or so. When you come down to rural communities in Afghanistan, quite often, irrespective of where you are, people often have the feeling that other provinces are being prioritized and we are not getting very much at all. And I think even though the authorities do not have capacity to plan for development necessarily full scale in terms of how big populations there are, as you were mentioning, still the basic services that are being put in place are being very rationally distributed based on population and so on. So, for instance, healthcare is fully planned on the basis of what kind of population is in this province, what kind of services are required. Likewise, the system of National Solidarity Program system where you channel funds through the communities that goes into the provinces you mentioned in a similar way with exactly the same kind of calculations in terms of how much funding goes to each household as everywhere else in Afghanistan. So I think sometimes we perhaps need to update our own understanding of what has happened the last few years in Afghanistan, where they have actually progressed on starting to address the unequal distribution of aid. But I fully agree, especially during the massive military funding, which was extremely frustrating for such actors as us and many others, was to see how money didn't go for development purpose and long-term capacity building of people who needed to be empowered, but rather for just short-term stabilization and their own objectives, so to speak.
Right. I think we have time for another one or two final questions before we have to round up. So over here, I see two hands.
Hi, my name is Lina Fonsett, and I work for SAC in 2005 to 2007 in Wardak with NSB Women's Participation. And I actually left Sweden then, and I just came back now from Washington. And today I was listening to a seminar at CEDA, and I heard that one of the main points in the new strategy is how to work with conflict countries. And it was very interesting to listen to you, Stefan, Andreas, sorry.
It's Andreas Stefansson.
Yeah,
Stefan
Andreas.
Don't worry.
And to hear also how the perception towards women or women's participation has improved. When I left Afghanistan, I was so frustrated to see many of these villages that I worked with in Wardak, and after a while I couldn't visit them. And still, the changes, there has been changes, positive changes, and also how you've been using innovative ways of towards insecurity. And my question is, what can CEDA learn from an organization like SAC? Because and working in conflict countries, because this is it's very tricky to work in conflict countries, but donors have to work there.
Shall we take the other question directly so they can answer them together?
I was thinking about the National Solidarity Program that you were talking about. I think it was Adam Payne. And my question is, how can we emphasize on this issue? And can we see a successful program later in long term? So yeah, I was just thinking about the National Solidarity Program that you were talking about.
I think that has to be the final questions. Yes. So please, Karin.
Yes, I think on what CEDA can learn from SAC, I mean, we have sort of different positions in that Swedish committee is an implementer, and we are a development partner. But CEDA is right now, I mean, taking this seriously, the issue of how to staff our offices in conflict countries with long-term competent staff, how to do follow-up and monitoring, and how to adapt development cooperation so it actually fits conflict countries. And we have been working in conflict countries for a long, long, long time, and I think we have been adapting as we have been going along. But this is a way of CEDA now to meet the challenge that in the future, the majority of people living in poverty will be living in conflict countries. That is where we will be working. The normality will be conflict countries. It will not be Tanzania or Kenya or whatever. The normality for a CEDA employee to work will be in a conflict country. And I think it's extremely good that we are taking those steps now. And of course, we can learn from Swedish committee, but also understanding that we have different roles as donors and as implementers. And on National Solidarity Program, there is since 2016, a new program has been rolled out, Citizens Charter, which builds on National Solidarity Program. And it puts more emphasis on the accountability aspect. How can people hold their administration accountable for providing services to them? So that has been strengthened. You still have the community development councils with, I think now it's 50% women in them that prioritize the village's needs. But you have added the accountability aspect to a much stronger aspect. Yeah.
I could also just add that one thing that I find fascinating with the Citizens Charter concept is that it also makes it much clearer what basic services should be guaranteed, kind of a package of basic services that comes as rights to each village. So there are standards that are set now that have to be achieved in each village in terms of access to healthcare, education, access to clean water, and so on. Quite ambitious. But I think that's kind of a stronger, as you say, then also enabling local communities to hold government to account. It actually links the line ministries that are to work with those services stronger to the local community, which in turn is that kind of project I was talking about before, the social contract that is currently being negotiated in Afghanistan.
Right. So, thanks a lot. I think we have been here almost 2 hours, and I think there's been a lot of interest from the audience and very interesting presentations. So I'd like to thank everyone who has come here today, and not least to the panelists, and I think they need a final applause, all of them.